first question I want to address is, in the words of Mario, why always me? What qualifies me to talk about this subject? As you can see from this slide, I've been working in this area for quite a number of years, and before this covers work over the last 7 or 8 years using social media. But before that, I've been working online for 15 years or more, using what we used to call Web 1.0 before we moved on to social tools. And I'm going to describe some of the work that we've done, as well as just talking about social media in education in a more general context. So the first question is, what is social media, just so that we're all agreed on what it is. For the purposes of this talk, I've summarized it on this rather confusing slide. I've deliberately chosen this image with this blizzard of website logos that you find, this very confusing array of names and services, but it doesn't need to be that confusing, and I'll try and zero in on some of the more important points. But just as a definition for the purposes of this talk, social media are internet services where the content is generated by the users of the service, and it has a number of different names. It's called Web 1.0 or participatory media or whatever, but in general that's what we're talking about. So the sorts of things you will be familiar with. So there are a wide range of tools available. So we have familiar social networking tools such as Facebook, Google Plus and Twitter, various blogging tools, including things that you might not think of immediately as blogging tools, such as photo blogging sites such as Blip Photo and Flickr, and indeed YouTube for video blogging, wikis, social bookmarking and annotation, because these are social sites, because you can share the data on these sites, collaborative writing, Google Docs as it used to be called, now called Google Drive, Wallwisher is now called Padlet, and so on. Presentations, being able to share presentations on SlideShare, Google Drive, and of course on YouTube. Mind mapping tools, curation tools where you can gather resources together, comment on them and present them to other people, file sharing, and conferencing tools. Now, I don't want to spend a long time doing anything which is intended to be in any way a definitive list of social media tools, because as soon as I publish such a list, it will be out of date. And I'm also not giving URLs for any of these services, partly because the names and even the URLs change sometimes. So the advice is, if you're interested in any of these things, Google it. Don't rely on a list, because really constructing a directory of these services is not really very helpful. So what I really want to talk about is why might you want to consider using social tools in education. If you think of education as professional training rather than simply as transmitting complicated subject matter, then training people how to use social media surely needs to be a part of that process. And by the same token, developing transferable skills and employability skills, and social media is becoming increasingly important in the workplace for most professions, that really needs to be part of the professional training that students receive in education. Something that's very interesting is engaging students as producers, this concept of learning partnerships. Rather than students simply being passive consumers of media, they can get increasing intellectual ownership of their learning, particularly the media and the content that's part of their learning, by being producers of that content rather than merely consumers of it in a passive sense. And I think that's an extremely powerful way of engaging students with education with the tools that we now have available, and a very powerful argument. Now, exactly how you employ social media in your context is definitely not something that I am empowered to tell you about. This is something that you will need to think about your local circumstances, and you'll need to think about the learning outcomes for whatever programs you're involved in. And so I'm deliberately in this talk staying away from the details of how to do this. I merely want you to think about the reasons why you might want to do it. So just going back to my own experience and potentially an illustration of this, I've been very influenced over the last few years by work that Dave White has done in Oxford based on this concept of visitors and residents. And this sees internet users as a continuum, so that these aren't mutually exclusive groups. People will map between these groups in various locations on different services, either as visitors, and a visitor typically sees the web or the internet as a collection of tools. They see things as an individual space, possibly a private space, and they're very goal orientated. They log on to a particular website to achieve a particular task. And in a student context, we found that students that have a visitor mindset tend to see information presented online as authoritative. In contrast to that, residents see the web as a space rather than as a tool. And when they log on to a service, they tend to be social. They tend to be looking for communications. They want things to be public and to be visible. They don't necessarily want things to be private. They want to share with other people, and they want to see what other people are doing. And they're less task focused. They tend to be rather nebulous in their purposes. They're conversational. And if you go to this URL, just pause the video and type it in for a moment if you want to go to that site, then you can hear Dave White explaining this concept much more eloquently than I have. And over the past few years, if you refer back to the papers on the second slide, you can see some of the work that we've done looking at student attitudes to social tools. And that's been based on this threefold framework. Firstly, the network that students build for themselves, and I'll show you some examples of that shortly. Secondly, the context, what they say about the reasons for using certain tools and their reactions to certain tools. And thirdly, the content. So the content is easy to derive. For the content, you just see what they post on the site and you can analyze that content. The context you can't get directly from the site itself. You have to get it as metadata, and we do that by running questionnaires. And the network information, such as this, is made by analyzing the connections that students form. So we see this is data based on student use of Google Plus, for example. We see many students that form networks like this, highly centralized networks, where we've encouraged them to share and to communicate with their peers. And the advantage of that is they form this very tight cluster, or hairball as we call it, in the center of the network. But that is actually what we want, because it means that students on a given module are communicating with each other. Other students form more diverse networks, so we still have this modular cluster here, but we also have these outlying groups, which are various members of academic staff and other people who are much more loosely connected to the actual module that this exercise was conducted on. And then a few students form much smaller networks, and these are quite interesting students to look at, and their responses to social tools and the content that they post and the way they approach them is very different from students that form networks such as this. So again, going back to this threefold approach of network mapping, context analysis, content analysis, and contextual analysis, this has been a very powerful way of looking at what students do online. But we've found, and many other people have found, that student motivation needs to be directed. In our case, we find that unless students are driven to use social tools by extrinsic motivations such as assessment, in other words, you give them marks for doing particular tasks, they don't engage with social tools, or at least only a minority of students will engage with social tools. The intrinsic motivation is a minority attraction in our cases. There are other instances where people have reported that students engage with these things without being driven, but many people have found, and certainly we've found, that unless you use assessment as a driver, then students don't engage with social tools. Now, I've been happy with this, and the rationale for using assessment as a driver is because if you don't get the majority of students engaged with a particular social tool, then that social tool has very little value. So I rationalize that for that reason. But it's not ideal, there's no question about that. And so this year, for example, I've experimented with removing the assessment as driver just to see what happens. And I can sum that up in the following slide. Essentially, it's a ghost town. Without assessment as driver, as we'd known from data we've collected previously, very few students will engage with those tools. So something that I've been particularly interested in over the course of the last year is this emerging concept which was published in the Atlantic magazine back in the autumn, which has been called dark social. And I've written quite a lot about this, about my experiences of dealing with students online in a dark social kind of way at this URL. But just to give you an outline, I suggest you go and read the Atlantic article. But just to give you the TLDR, which is the too long didn't read version, the data that you can actually see on social sites such as Twitter and Facebook is really only the tip of the iceberg. It's discussed a lot because it's easy to measure. But tools such as email and internet messaging and private messaging that occur on sites such as Facebook, but which can't be measured, actually form the majority of traffic. And you can show that by looking at referrals to various sites. The majority of the traffic comes from these dark social sources, people recommending things privately and by email rather than publicly. And we've been using email much more predominantly to communicate with students over the course of the last year. And as I said, if you go to this URL, you can read about the results that we've had. So this brings me on to this idea of digital literacies and how you can discuss them and how they fit into this pattern of social media and social networking. The definitions of digital literacy are somewhat flexible. Not everyone uses the same definition, but I certainly think of this in this pyramid type model. Digital competencies are things that students can do, and skills are the things that they need in order to achieve those competencies. And they are quite easy to measure and to assess, either for individuals or for academic staff. So you can measure if somebody is competent to carry out a particular task online, either something as simple as sending an email, or maybe something more complicated such as writing a blog over a period of time, or creating a Twitter account and using that to communicate with people on a given module or who are interested in a given topic. So the skills are the skills which people need to carry out the competencies, but sitting on top of this and much less easy to assess are digital literacies, how facile people are at doing this and how well they pick up on the intricacies and the sophistications of these processes. And it's not easy to assess this or to measure this, and it's not easy really for students to see their own development within the sphere of digital literacy in the same way that it is in digital competence in terms of simpler tasks which can be atomized, like digital competencies and skills. So I think it's useful to think about the things that students do online in terms of this pyramid structure. And if you're thinking about how to structure tasks and how to measure them, then I think this is a useful model to think about.